Emma Faulkner had always believed that if there was one thing in life no one could take from you, it was the past. People could rewrite records, manipulate history, and twist reality to fit whatever narrative suited them, but memories, those were sacred. They belonged to the ones who carried them, untouched and immutable. And for Emma, her past was rooted in one place, the house her parents had built with their own hands, a home that had stood as a testament to their resilience, their sacrifices, and the kind of hard-earned stability that most people spend a lifetime trying to achieve. It wasn't just a structure of wood, brick, and glass. It was a legacy, a tangible reminder of everything her family had endured and conquered. That was why, when she turned the final corner onto Sycamore Lane, after months away on a project out of state, she expected the familiar sight of the house to greet her like an old friend. She anticipated the slight sag of the front porch steps that her father had always promised to fix but never got around to, the ivy creeping up the side of the brick walls, the weathered oak tree in the front yard that had stood longer than she had been alive. Instead, she found nothing. Emma's foot slammed on the brake harder than she realized, tires skidding slightly against the asphalt as her entire body locked up. Her breath stalled in her throat as her mind struggled to process what she was seeing, or rather, what she wasn't seeing. Where her home had once stood, there was only a barren, leveled lot. No rubble, no wreckage, no indication that a house had ever existed there at all. Just smooth, compacted dirt, stretching from one end of the property to the other, as if someone had erased her family's history from existence with surgical precision. For a long moment, she just sat there, gripping the steering wheel with both hands, her knuckles white. The world outside her windshield blurred slightly, her own breath fogging the glass as the weight of realization pressed down on her chest. This wasn't possible. Houses didn't just disappear. They burned, they collapsed, they deteriorated, but they didn't just cease to exist overnight. Something was wrong, and the cold weight of dread in her stomach told her that whatever had happened here, it had been deliberate. She barely noticed as she unbuckled her seatbelt and shoved the car door open, stepping out onto the curb with mechanical movements, her pulse hammering so loudly in her ears that it drowned out the distant hum of lawnmowers and chirping birds. The neighborhood was still, eerily unchanged from the last time she had been here, except for the gaping void where her home should have been. Across the street, a few of the older residents were outside tending to their gardens, some casting sideways glances in her direction before quickly averting their eyes. They knew something. Emma swallowed, her throat dry as she forced her legs to move, taking slow, measured steps onto the property. The ground felt unnatural beneath her feet, too flat, too neat, too artificial. Whoever had done this hadn't just knocked the house down, they had erased it. No debris, no foundation remnants, not even the outline of where the walls had once stood. Jesus Christ, she muttered under her breath, running a hand through her hair as she turned in a slow circle, trying to make sense of the impossible. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some freak natural disaster. Someone had done this on purpose. A movement to her left caught her eye, and she turned just in time to see a man in a crisp navy suit standing near the edge of the property, clipboard in hand. He wasn't one of the workers packing up equipment further down the street. He wasn't a neighbor. He was watching her, studying her reaction with a blank, almost clinical expression. When he realized she had noticed him, he gave a polite, almost practiced smile. "Miss Faulkner?" His voice was smooth, professional, the kind of tone used by men who had spent years turning bad news into bureaucratic formalities. Emma stared at him, her body still thrumming with shock and adrenaline. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded, taking a step closer, but the man didn't flinch. "My name is Victor Crawford. I represent the Neighborhood Compliance Committee." His tone remained neutral, unaffected by the way she was practically shaking now. "I was told you would be returning today. I assume you have some questions." Emma's jaw tightened, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. Questions? That was an understatement. She had about 1,000,000, but the only one that mattered right now clawed its way past her lips. "Where the fuck is my house?" Crawford's polite expression didn't waver. If he was affected by her fury, he hid it well. He simply glanced down at his clipboard and flipped a page, as if confirming a detail that wasn't already etched into his memory. Your property was found to be in violation of several updated aesthetic and safety regulations outlined by the association's revised neighborhood code. As per standard procedure, you were notified multiple times regarding the required corrective actions, which due to failure to comply resulted in the necessary demolition of the structure. Emma blinked, for a moment convinced she had misheard him. Demolition. The word sat heavy in her mind, foreign and grotesque, completely at odds with reality. They had demolished her home. Not condemned it, not ordered renovations, they had erased it from the ground like it had never existed. She took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them, her voice low and sharp. I never received any notices. Crawford didn't react. All necessary paperwork was filed, and notices were sent to the listed address. Emma's nails dug into her palms, the words slicing through her like glass. This was the listed address. There was the faintest flicker in his expression, gone as quickly as it appeared, and that told her everything she needed to know. They had done this on purpose. Whatever justification they had used, whatever fabricated violations they had documented, it had never been about compliance. It had been about getting rid of her home. Her voice came out quieter this time, but far deadlier. Who approved this? Crawford exhaled softly through his nose, almost as if he were disappointed that she wasn't accepting this like a reasonable person should. Ms. Faulkner, I assure you that everything was handled in accordance with policy. That wasn't an answer. It was a script. Emma took another step forward. She wasn't playing this game. Her home was gone, her family's legacy wiped from existence without her knowledge, and now she was standing in front of the man who had orchestrated it, a man who wasn't the least bit concerned about how she would respond. That was a mistake, because she wasn't just going to ask questions. She was going to burn down whoever was responsible for this. And she would start with Victor Crawford. Emma stood rooted to the spot, staring at Victor Crawford, as if willing him to break character, to show some flicker of guilt, some small sign that he recognized the gravity of what had been done. But he didn't. He remained as he was, composed, detached, utterly unfazed by the fact that he had just informed her, in the most bureaucratic way possible, that her home had been erased from existence under the guise of regulation. The weight of his indifference settled in her stomach like a stone, cold and heavy, mixing with the molten fury simmering beneath her ribs. This wasn't some clerical error. This wasn't an unfortunate misunderstanding. This was deliberate, and the sheer arrogance in Crawford's tone, the way he dismissed her devastation with nothing more than a carefully rehearsed statement, told her one thing with absolute certainty: he expected her to accept it. She took a slow breath, steadying herself against the violent urge to rip the clipboard from his hands and hurl it into the street. You keep saying notices, but I never received anything. No letters, no emails, no phone calls. She enunciated every word carefully, daring him to contradict her, but Crawford merely offered the same placid, practiced expression. All necessary documentation was processed accordingly, and notification attempts were made in compliance with our procedures. If you failed to receive them, I suggest you check with your forwarding address. A muscle twitched in her jaw. I don't have a forwarding address. My mail is delivered here, and since you so kindly decided to demolish my home, where exactly do you think those notices were sent? Crawford blinked, his lips pressing into something that might have been the closest thing to an actual reaction. It was subtle, but Emma caught at the faint hesitation, the brief pause before his next response. That meant he knew. He knew exactly what had happened, knew there had been no legitimate attempt to contact her, and now he was scrambling for the next excuse. She had him. For a split second, Emma thought he might actually admit to the deception, but then his shoulders squared ever so slightly, and the neutral expression returned. If there was a miscommunication in the notification process, I'm afraid that falls outside my jurisdiction. I only handle enforcement. Emma let out a sharp, humorless laugh, the sound cutting through the otherwise silent street. Enforcement? Is that what we're calling demolishing private property without owner consent these days? Crawford didn't respond, and that infuriated her more than if he had. His silence wasn't an admission of wrongdoing, it was a statement. He didn't care. Whatever had been done, whatever shady loopholes had been exploited to justify it, was no longer his problem. It was hers. Her hands clenched at her sides, nails biting into her palms. I want to see the paperwork. For the first time, Crawford's expression flickered with something else: annoyance, maybe even mild surprise. Clearly, he hadn't expected her to push this far. The documents are all on file with the local zoning office, he said after a beat, though his tone had shifted, losing some of its effortless condescension. If you have concerns, I recommend submitting a formal inquiry. Emma didn't so much as blink. Then I'll go there now. His lips twitched downward almost imperceptibly, but it was enough. He didn't want her to do that. I suggest making an appointment, he said smoothly, already flipping to a new page on his clipboard, as if dismissing her entirely. They don't typically process walk-ins. Emma didn't wait to hear the rest. She turned on her heel, ignoring the way her pulse thundered in her ears, and stalked back toward her car. Her fingers trembled as she yanked the door open, slamming it shut behind her, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles went white. She needed to get herself under control. The raw, seething anger boiling in her veins wouldn't help her right now. Thinking would. Taking a slow breath, she pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts, hovering over the name she hadn't called in years. She hesitated, if only for a moment, before pressing dial. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Emma? She exhaled. Dan, I need your help. Daniel Harris had been a detective before he got tired of fighting a system designed to fail the people it was supposed to protect. He had walked away from his badge, disgusted by the layers of corruption he had uncovered over the years, and now worked in the private sector doing investigative consulting. If there was anyone who could help her figure out what the hell had just happened, it was him. Where are you? His voice sharpened instantly, all traces of casual familiarity gone. She swallowed. My house. Or at least where it used to be. There was a pause. Then, quietly, I'll be there in 10. True to his word, Dan's SUV rolled up to the curb less than 10 minutes later. He barely had the door open before she was already walking toward him, her breath coming short and clipped as she fought to maintain some semblance of control. She had expected surprise, maybe even skepticism, but when he stepped out and took in the empty lot behind her, his expression barely changed. He wasn't surprised. You knew. The words came out sharper than she intended, but Dan didn't flinch. I had a feeling, he admitted, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. Your neighborhood's been on the radar for a while. Emma's stomach twisted. What do you mean, on the radar? Dan exhaled slowly, glancing around before lowering his voice. You're not the first. Properties in this area have been disappearing off records for months. The city's been fast-tracking redevelopment projects left and right, and any private homeowner standing in the way has conveniently been removed through legal loopholes. Most of them don't fight it. He gave her a pointed look. I take it you're not most people. Her jaw tightened. No, I'm not. Dan nodded, his expression unreadable. Then let's get to work. They spent the next 2 hours digging through records, making calls, tracing paper trails that led to one glaringly obvious conclusion: her home hadn't just been demolished. It had been stolen. The documents at the zoning office listed an order for demolition, but the details were full of discrepancies, wrong dates, a falsified signature, an official approval stamp from someone who no longer worked for the city. Whoever had orchestrated this had banked on the assumption that Emma wouldn't ask questions. They had been wrong. She closed the last file, her pulse steady and controlled in a way it hadn't been since she arrived. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost disturbingly so. "They erased my house," she said, meeting Dan's gaze. "Now I'm going to erase them." Dan studied her for a long moment before nodding once. "Then let's do it." "Through it." Emma sat in Dan's car, her hands gripping the edge of the leather seat, her mind moving too fast to process a single coherent thought. The weight of what they had just uncovered pressed down on her like a vice, the full realization settling into place like a blade slicing through skin. This wasn't just a case of bureaucratic negligence or an overzealous neighborhood committee enforcing their so-called aesthetic standards. This was a deliberate, calculated theft, executed with a level of precision that suggested whoever was behind it had done this before and fully expected to get away with it. Her house hadn't been destroyed, it had been erased. She turned her head toward Dan, who was sifting through the stack of documents they had managed to collect in the last few hours, his brow furrowed as he scanned page after page. The car was parked a few blocks from City Hall, out of view of any security cameras, and they had been sitting there in silence for nearly 20 minutes, neither of them speaking as they both processed the sheer scope of what they had uncovered. Emma finally exhaled, her voice measured but taut. "What's the first move?" Dan didn't answer immediately. He was still flipping through the file, eyes narrowing at something she couldn't see. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but there was a sharpness to it that told her he had found something significant. "These documents are a mess. Half of them contradict each other." "The order for demolition?" "It was submitted 4 different times, under 4 different department codes, all within a 24-hour window." "That's not an accident. That's someone deliberately muddying the records to make it harder to track who actually signed off on this." Emma's fingers curled into a fist against her knee. "So, we don't know who pulled the trigger." Dan shook his head. "Not yet. But someone wanted this to look legitimate just long enough to get it done, and then they buried the trail as fast as they could. The problem is, they weren't careful enough. There are names attached to these requests: clerks, supervisors, property assessors. Someone pushed the paperwork through, and someone signed off on it. We just have to find out who." Emma clenched her jaw, inhaling sharply through her nose. "And then what?" Dan closed the file, glancing at her for the first time since they had gotten in the car. "Then we make them talk." There was something about the way he said it that sent a small, involuntary shiver down her spine, not out of fear, but because for the first time since she had driven onto Sycamore Lane and found her home gone, she felt something other than helpless rage. She felt momentum. Dan started the engine, merging onto the main road, his gaze fixed ahead. "There's only one way to handle this. We need to apply pressure to the right people, the ones who processed this, the ones who saw something was off but kept their mouths shut. Bureaucracy is like a machine. Every cog, no matter how small, plays a part. Find the weak one, and the whole thing collapses." Emma watched the buildings blur past as they drove, her pulse steadying, her thoughts sharpening. "And who's our weakest link?" Dan's lips curled slightly, a flicker of something resembling satisfaction passing over his features. "A man named Philip Garner." She didn't recognize the name, but that didn't matter. If Dan said he was the key, then she was ready to find out why. Philip Garner's name had appeared on 2 separate demolition orders, both signed within an hour of each other under different department heads, one of whom had retired 6 months ago. That alone was suspicious, but when Dan pulled his financial records, things got even more interesting. Garner, a mid-level zoning official, made an average civil servant's salary, yet his bank account showed 3 large deposits in the last 2 months, each from different shell companies. Emma had spent enough time around contractors to know what that meant. For bribes. They found him exactly where Dan predicted they would, at a bar just outside the city limits, the kind of place where bureaucrats went to drink away the weight of whatever corruption they were involved in, hoping that a cheap whiskey buzz would dull the guilt. He was sitting in a booth near the back, hunched over a glass that was already half empty, despite it being barely past 6 in the evening. Emma slid into the seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. Dan followed, blocking his exit from the booth. Garner barely had time to register their presence before she spoke, her voice quiet, but carrying an edge of cold steel. "We need to talk about Sycamore Lane." Garner stiffened, fingers tightening around his glass. "I don't know what you're talking about." Emma didn't blink. "You signed off on an illegal demolition." His jaw twitched. Everything was done by the book. Dan leaned forward, placing a thin folder onto the table and flipping it open. Inside were copies of the falsified documents, the bank transfers, and a highlighted section showing the forged signature of a city official who no longer worked there. Emma tapped a finger against the page. "That looks like fraud to me." Garner swallowed, his gaze darting toward the exit. Dan didn't move, his presence looming silent but unmistakably threatening. Emma let the silence stretch between them before she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make him sweat. "The way I see it, you have two options. You can tell us who paid you, who ordered this, and maybe I'll let you walk out of here without calling the state attorney's office." Or she let the threat hang in the air. Garner's face had gone pale. He licked his lips, glancing at the documents again, and Emma saw the exact moment he realized there was no way out of this. His shoulders slumped. He exhaled sharply. And then, finally, he spoke. "It wasn't just me." His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "There's a group, contractors, developers, city officials. They're fast-tracking redevelopment projects, but only after eliminating private property obstacles. If someone doesn't sell, they fabricate violations, push through zoning changes, make it impossible for homeowners to keep up. If that doesn't work," he hesitated, swallowing, "they make the problem disappear." Emma's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "Who's running it?" Garner hesitated again, glancing toward Dan, who hadn't said a word since they sat down. The former detective met his gaze without blinking, his expression unreadable. Garner exhaled. "Victor Crawford." Emma's blood turned ice cold. She wasn't surprised. She was enraged. Crawford hadn't just been a messenger. He had been the executioner. Garner rubbed a hand over his face, his fingers shaking slightly. "Look, you don't get it. These people, if they know I talked to you, I'm done." Emma stared at him for a long moment before finally standing. "Then you better hope they don't find out." She turned to leave, her heart pounding as everything clicked into place. Dan followed, but just before they reached the door, she heard Garner's voice, low and strained. "You don't understand, Faulkner. Crawford isn't the one in charge." Emma froze. She turned back, eyes sharp. "Then who is?" Garner swallowed. "The people who own him." For the first time since this started, Emma realized she wasn't just up against a corrupt official. She was up against something much bigger. Emma sat in the passenger seat of Dan's SUV, staring at the dimly lit streets as they passed, the weight of Garner's last words pressing into her chest like an iron fist. Crawford isn't the one in charge. She had known from the moment she looked into his eyes that he wasn't the true mastermind behind what had happened to her house, but hearing it confirmed, knowing that there was someone else, someone bigger, someone with more power, more reach, turned her anger into something heavier, something colder. She had spent the last 48 hours believing that if she could just take down Crawford, she could unravel everything, expose the corruption, force them to make it right. Now she realized she had only been looking at the surface, at the part they wanted people to see. Whoever owned Crawford was working from the shadows, pulling the strings, making the decisions that wiped entire homes off the map without a trace. And that meant if she wanted to win, she had to stop thinking like someone trying to get justice. She had to start thinking like someone out for blood. Dan took a sharp left, his fingers tight around the steering wheel, his face unreadable in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "We need leverage." His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it, something dark and knowing, like he had already mapped out every move before she even had a chance to speak. Emma turned her head toward him, the cold determination in her chest mirroring his own. Garner wasn't the only one signing off on these demolitions, she said. If this has been happening for months, if they've erased more than a dozen homes, there have to be more people involved. More paperwork. More loose ends. Dan nodded, his eyes never leaving the road. We find the right one, and we don't just expose them. We make them afraid. It was nearly midnight when they arrived at the storage facility on the edge of town, a sprawling complex of dull metal units bathed in the sickly orange glow of flickering streetlights. Dan had called in a favor with someone who still owed him from his days as a detective, and now they had access to a unit filled with records, zoning files, land acquisitions, contracts signed in the dead of night with no public record of who authorized them. Emma pulled her jacket tighter around herself as they stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of dust and paper, the silence pressing against her ears. Dan moved to one of the shelves, pulling a box down and flipping it open with quick, efficient hands. Here, he muttered, sifting through pages. These are all the properties flagged for redevelopment in the last 18 months. Emma stepped closer, scanning the list over his shoulder, her pulse spiking as she recognized the addresses. Some were homes she had passed by every day without a second thought. Others had been abandoned so long she had assumed the owners had left willingly. But at least 4 of them, 4 names, 4 families she knew personally. Her throat tightened as she ran her fingers over the faded ink, her mind flashing back to conversations she had never thought twice about. Mr. Delaney, who had been forced to sell after a sudden legal dispute over property boundaries. The Vasquez family, who had woken up one morning to find their home condemned without explanation. Eleanor Hayes, the woman who had lived on the corner of Sycamore Lane for 50 years, now fighting an endless legal battle to keep what was rightfully hers. Emma's hands curled into fists. This wasn't just happening to her. It had been happening for years. Dan was already pulling out his phone. We need to talk to Eleanor first. Emma nodded, her mind racing ahead, trying to anticipate what came next. If Eleanor's house hadn't been demolished yet, there had to be a reason. Either she had something they needed, or she had someone protecting her from the same fate as the others. Either way, she was a loose end they hadn't tied up yet. And loose ends were dangerous. They found Eleanor the next morning at a small diner just outside the city, a weathered notebook open in front of her, a cup of coffee resting untouched at her side. She didn't look surprised to see them. If anything, she looked like she had been waiting. Emma slid into the booth across from her, Dan taking the seat next to her, his movements careful, controlled. Eleanor watched them for a long moment before finally speaking. "I know why you're here," she said simply, her voice steady, unshaken. Emma met her gaze without hesitation. "Then you know what we need." Eleanor's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I know you think you're the first ones to come to me with evidence. You're not." Dan leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table. "And yet you're still here. Your house is still standing." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but Emma caught the slight shift in her posture, the way her fingers twitched slightly against the worn leather of her notebook. She was nervous. Not of them, but of what they were about to drag her into. "They haven't taken it yet," Eleanor admitted, her voice quieter now, as if she didn't want the walls to hear, "because they need what's under it." Emma frowned, glancing at Dan, but he was already ahead of her. "Oil?" he asked. "Mineral rights?" Eleanor shook her head. "Nothing that's simple. The land was flagged years ago for environmental study. They tried to get me to sign off on a land survey back in 2018, but I refused. They don't just want the property. They want control over it before anyone else realizes what's there." Emma felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't just about gentrification. This wasn't about making room for a new development. This was about ownership, about control over something more valuable than just another luxury condo project. Dan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. If they're willing to bury this much, they won't just let you walk away. Eleanor nodded once, slow and deliberate. They already warned me. Emma stiffened. What do you mean, warned? Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the table. Emma's stomach turned as she read the words printed in neat, bureaucratic font. Notice of eminent domain claim. Below it, in small, almost dismissive text, were the words, "This property is now subject to immediate forfeiture under Municipal Code 17A. Demolition scheduled pending final review." Emma's grip tightened around the edges of the paper. They're forcing you out. Eleanor nodded. And if I fight them, I'll disappear just like the others. A slow, creeping rage filled Emma's veins. They were still doing it. Even after everything she had uncovered, even after everything they had learned, they were still taking homes, still rewriting history, still making sure no one could stand in their way. She met Dan's gaze, saw the same fire burning there, the same cold understanding. They think they can keep getting away with this, she said quietly. Dan nodded. Then we show them what happens when they can't. Eleanor closed her notebook, her voice steady but firm. What's the plan? Emma exhaled. We make it public. We force them into the light. No more hiding behind committees, no more buried paperwork. We show people exactly what they've been doing. Dan pulled out his phone, already dialing. And we start with Crawford. Emma smiled, but there was no warmth in it. This time she was the one holding the leash. Emma barely slept. She had never been the kind of person who let anger consume her, who let frustration dictate her next move, but there was something about this fight. Something about knowing she wasn't just battling a corrupt official or a greedy developer, but an entire system designed to erase people like her, people who refused to sell, people who refused to bow, people who were in the way that made it impossible to turn her mind off. Even with Dan assuring her that they were making progress, that every document they uncovered, every record they pulled, was another nail in the coffin for the people behind this, she still felt the gnawing sense of urgency pressing against her ribs like a vice. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. She stood in the dim light of her borrowed apartment, staring at the files spread out across the table, pages covered in red pen, names circled, connections drawn. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that this was bigger than anyone had realized. This wasn't just about Crawford or even the local government. This was an operation. A carefully orchestrated, financially motivated system of land acquisition buried under layers of legal maneuvering and bureaucratic red tape. Every property that had been seized, every home that had been wiped from existence, had been part of a larger, more calculated plan. They weren't just clearing space for new developments. They were systematically targeting areas with high long-term value locations flagged for future projects, land that would be worth 10, 20, to 50 times more in the coming years. And the people behind it had the money, the influence, and the power to ensure that no one stood in their way. Until now. Dan was already making calls before the sun was up, his voice low but sharp, issuing orders to contacts Emma didn't know and wasn't sure she wanted to. He had been calm in the beginning, measured, treating this like just another case, just another corruption scandal waiting to be unraveled. But something had changed after they spoke to Eleanor. Something about watching an old woman forced to fight for the home she had lived in for 5 decades, knowing that she was only standing because she was the last piece of land they hadn't managed to steal yet, had flipped a switch inside him. Now he wasn't just looking for evidence. He was looking for a way to tear this entire machine apart. They're getting desperate, he said finally, setting his phone down and rubbing a hand over his face. Crawford's gone underground. No one's seen him since yesterday. Emma frowned. You think they pulled him out? Dan exhaled. I think he was never the one we needed to worry about. He was just the middleman. They're protecting someone else. Emma's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Then we forced them out. Dan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. There's one way to do that. He pulled a folder from the pile, flipping it open to reveal a map of the city, red lines drawn over certain areas, dates scrawled in the margins. Emma's eyes narrowed. What am I looking at? Dan tapped a specific section, one that had been marked more aggressively than the others. This is what's next. The properties they haven't cleared yet, but will. They've already started the paperwork, already begun the process of forcing people out. If we go public with this now, if we show people what's coming before it happens, they won't be able to hide anymore. They'll have to answer for it. Emma's pulse picked up. And if they don't, Dan's expression darkened. Then we make sure they regret it. They didn't go to the press. That would have been too easy to control, too simple to spin. Instead, they took a different route one Crawford and his people wouldn't expect. They went to the people who had lost everything. The families who had been forced out, the homeowners who had woken up to find their property no longer belonged to them, the ones who had been silenced with settlements and legal threats. They gathered them, one by one, pulling them into the same room, laying out every document, every falsified order, every forged signature. Some were hesitant at first, unwilling to reopen old wounds, unwilling to believe that fighting back would accomplish anything. But then Eleanor spoke. Then Mr. Delaney, then the Vasquez family, then the dozens of others who had been left with nothing. By the end of the night, they weren't just witnesses. They were an army. And they were ready to fight. The next day, the city offices were flooded with formal complaints, lawsuits, demands for investigation. It was too much, too loud, too fast for them to contain. It forced them into the light, forced them to scramble for damage control, to find a way to put out a fire that had already spread beyond their control. But Crawford's people weren't just powerful, they were ruthless. And they weren't going to sit back and watch everything they had built fall apart without a fight. That night, Emma's car was broken into. Nothing stolen. Just papers scattered across the seats, her glove compartment ripped open, the words "Stop digging" scratched into the dashboard with something sharp. The message was clear. Dan didn't say anything when he saw it. He just clenched his jaw, pulled out his gun, and checked the magazine. Emma ran her fingers over the letters, the metal still rough where it had been carved. She felt the fear, recognized the danger, but beneath it, there was something else, something hotter, something sharp and unyielding. "They're scared," she said quietly. Dan's eyes were cold. Not scared enough. They escalated first. The next morning, Crawford resurfaced, but not by choice. He was found in an abandoned lot on the outskirts of town, his face bruised, his suit torn, his hands shaking as he was placed into the back of an unmarked car. Someone had gotten to him before they had, someone who had a much bigger reason to keep him quiet. Dan was already on the phone before Emma could process what was happening, his voice sharp, urgent. "They're cleaning house." Emma felt something sink in her chest. "Garner?" Dan exhaled through his nose. "Gone. No one's seen him since yesterday." Emma closed her eyes, swallowing hard. They had known this would happen. They had known the moment they pushed too hard, too fast, there would be consequences. But that didn't make it any easier to stomach. Dan hung up and turned to her, his expression unreadable. "We don't have time. We move now, or we don't move at all." Emma didn't hesitate. "Then let's end this." They weren't just fighting to get her house back anymore. They were fighting to make sure no one else ever lost theirs again. And this time they weren't going to stop until there was nothing left of the people who had taken everything. Emma had always believed that when the moment came, the final confrontation, the breaking point where everything boiled over, she would feel it. That there would be some kind of shift, some unmistakable sign that told her this was it, that the end was within reach. But as she stood in the dimly lit parking garage, the air thick with the smell of oil and concrete, watching Dan pull the last of the files from the trunk of his car, she realized the moment had already passed. They were already here. This was the fight. Not some dramatic showdown, not a last-minute revelation, not a perfectly timed victory. It was war. It had been war since the moment they erased her house, and she was only just now understanding how deep the battlefield went. Dan closed the trunk with a quiet, measured finality, his movements sharper than usual, more controlled. He was always like this when things were about to go bad. Emma had seen it in him before, back when they were younger, back when his badge still meant something, back when he still believed in things like justice and due process. Now there was nothing left of that man, just this calculated, precise, relentless. "They're moving fast," he said, voice low but firm. "Crawford's gone. Garner's gone. Whatever leverage we had, it's slipping." Emma exhaled slowly, her mind processing every piece of information at once, mapping out possibilities, adjusting for every worst-case scenario. "Then we hit them first." Dan studied her for a long second, then nodded. "We're already in motion. But if we don't lock this down tonight, they'll bury it by morning." That was the reality of what they were up against. Not just criminals, not just corrupt officials, but an entire system designed to absorb blows like this and keep moving. They had seen it happen before, stories that made the news for a week, investigations that got delayed, inquiries that got dismissed on technicalities. If they let up now, if they gave these people even a fraction of a second to regroup, it would all disappear. Eleanor's still holding, Dan continued, checking his watch. Her case is in limbo, but they haven't forced her out yet. Emma nodded. "Then that's our window. If they're still stalling on her, that means they're waiting on something. A final approval, a signature, something they don't have yet." Dan glanced at her. "You think you can find out what it is?" Emma flexed her fingers, the adrenaline already kicking in, sharpening her focus. "I know where to start." The city planning office was a fortress of bureaucracy, a place designed to keep people out, to make processes so difficult and time-consuming that most gave up before they ever got close to the truth. But Emma wasn't most people, and she wasn't interested in following the rules. She had spent the last 3 days tearing through records, memorizing names, tracking emails and signatures. She knew exactly who to look for, exactly where to apply pressure. She moved through the corridors like she belonged there, her steps quick, purposeful. Just another face in the sea of government employees working late to meet deadlines they didn't care about. When she reached the records department, she scanned the desks, her gaze locking onto a man hunched over his keyboard, typing furiously. David Ellis. Mid-level administrator, one of the last names attached to Eleanor's file. He wasn't a decision-maker. He was a bottleneck. Someone whose job wasn't to sign approvals but to delay them, to stall just long enough for everything to be finalized behind closed doors. Emma approached, setting a folder down on his desk without a word. Ellis barely glanced up, his fingers still moving over the keyboard, but the second he saw her expression, he stopped. "I need access to the pending approvals list," she said quietly. Ellis swallowed. I don't think I can do that." Emma leaned in slightly. "You already have." She tapped the folder. Inside were the same files he had processed, the same signatures he had forwarded, the same redirections he had used to push approvals through different channels. He wasn't just stalling, he was laundering paperwork, moving documents around so no one could track who had actually signed off on what. Ellis' hands shook slightly as he pushed the folder back toward her. "I don't know what you think this proves." Emma tilted her head. "It proves you've been following orders. It proves you know exactly what's happening. And it proves that if this goes public, your name will be attached to every single one of these fraudulent transfers." Ellis paled. I didn't." Emma didn't let him finish. "I don't care how deep you are in this. I don't care how much they paid you to look the other way. What I care about is Eleanor Hayes. Her file is still pending. That means someone, somewhere, is waiting for something before they move forward. I want to know what." Ellis hesitated. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled shakily and turned his monitor slightly toward her. "It's not a final approval," he muttered. "It's an investment contract." Emma's stomach twisted. "Explain." Ellis ran a hand over his face, his fingers still trembling. The development firm doesn't technically own the land yet. They're using a holding company to process the acquisitions. But the real money, the real buyers are foreign investors. They don't finalize purchases until all properties in a designated zone are cleared. That's why they haven't moved on Eleanor yet. She's the last piece. Emma felt something cold settle over her skin. This wasn't about local corruption. This was about real estate laundering on an international level. They need her gone, Ellis continued, voice barely above a whisper. And once she is, they can close the deal. Everything else gets washed clean. Emma straightened, her pulse slow but thunderous. They had them. She turned toward the door, already pulling out her phone. Dan answered on the second ring. They haven't closed the deal yet, she said, voice sharp, steady. Eleanor is the last holdout. They need her gone before they can finalize anything. Dan was silent for a moment. Then we make sure that doesn't happen. The next hour was chaos. Emma relayed the information to Eleanor, who, to her credit, didn't flinch. She had already known she was standing on something valuable. Now she knew exactly how much power that gave her. Dan made calls, activating contacts, setting up blockades that would make it legally impossible for the investors to finalize the purchase. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would hold long enough. And then, just as they were about to regroup, just as Emma was stepping out of the records office, her phone buzzed again. Dan's voice was urgent. Emma, you need to get out of there. Now. She barely had time to process the words before she spotted them. Two men, standing by the elevator, suits too crisp, too clean, eyes locked onto her the second she moved. Emma turned, her heart hammering. The fight wasn't coming. It was already here. Emma didn't hesitate. The moment she locked eyes with the men by the elevator, her instincts kicked in, and she turned sharply, moving toward the stairwell without breaking stride. Running would make her a target, hesitating would get her cornered, and right now she needed to get the hell out of the building before they had a chance to make a move. The stairwell door was heavy, the metal cool against her palm as she shoved it open and stepped inside, forcing herself to keep a steady pace as she descended. Her mind was already calculating exits, adjusting for worst-case scenarios. If they followed, she was ready. If they didn't, that meant something worse was coming. Dan's voice was still in her ear, sharp and urgent. Where are you? Leaving records, she muttered, taking the stairs two at a time now. Not alone. There was a pause. Then, clipped into the point, stay on the line. If they follow, you don't stop moving. Emma reached the second floor and kept going, her pulse steady, her breathing controlled. She wasn't new to this kind of pressure. She had spent years working in high-risk environments, dealing with contractors who didn't take no for an answer, men who thought power meant never having to hear the word no. But this wasn't just another negotiation. This was survival. By the time she reached the ground floor, she could hear footsteps echoing above her, quick and measured. They hadn't made a move in the hallway, but now they were following. Fast. Efficient. Trained. These weren't just security goons sent to intimidate her. These were people who knew exactly what they were doing. Emma pushed through the exit door and stepped into the cold night air, her mind already switching gears. The parking lot was half empty, the streetlights casting long, fractured shadows against the pavement. No time to think, no time to hesitate. She moved toward the curb, where Dan's SUV was already idling, the back door swinging open before she even reached it. Drive, she ordered the second she was inside, slamming the door shut behind her. Dan didn't ask questions. He hit the gas and the SUV surged forward, pulling out onto the street just as the men from the building stepped out onto the sidewalk. They didn't chase, didn't pull weapons, just watched as they drove away. Emma exhaled slowly, her muscles still tight, her hands curled into fists against her lap. They weren't there to talk. Dan didn't look at her, eyes locked on the road ahead. No, they weren't. They drove in silence for several blocks before he finally spoke again, his voice low and measured. "Did you get what we needed?" Emma nodded, pulling the flash drive from her pocket. Everything. The contracts, the funding sources, the shell companies. She turned to face him fully. "It's over. They can't move forward without Eleanor's property. They can't close the deal." Dan exhaled through his nose, but there was no relief in his expression. "They'll try." "They can't." Emma's grip tightened around the flash drive. "Not with what we have. This isn't just fraud. It's international money laundering. They're using these developments to move capital across borders, laundering dirty money through shell corporations disguised as real estate investments. That's not just a zoning violation. That's federal." Dan glanced at her then, the faintest glint of something dangerous in his eyes. "You think the feds will actually act on it?" "They won't have a choice," she said simply. "We don't give them one." The next 48 hours were a controlled storm of calculated destruction. Emma and Dan didn't go to the press that would have been too easy to manipulate, too simple to bury under the weight of legal threats and corporate PR spin. Instead, they went straight to the source. Emma handed the evidence off to a federal investigator specializing in financial crimes, a contact Dan had worked with years ago, someone who had no ties to the city, no stake in keeping things quiet. Within hours, a federal inquiry was launched. The contracts were frozen, the accounts flagged, and the land acquisitions put under immediate review. Every name attached to the documents, every official, every developer, every financier was suddenly under a microscope. Then and only then did they go public. By the time the first news reports broke, the machine had already been dismantled from the inside. There was no way to contain it, no way to spin it. People started talking the homeowners who had been forced out, the ones who had been paid off, the ones who had stayed silent out of fear. Suddenly there were too many voices, too many stories, too many damning pieces of evidence stacking up at once. And then came the arrests. The first was a mid-level contractor, one of the men responsible for pushing fraudulent paperwork through city channels. Then came a senior zoning official, caught trying to destroy electronic records before federal agents arrived. And then, finally, Victor Crawford. Emma watched from a distance as he was led out of his office in handcuffs, his expression carefully blank, but she could see at the realization, the moment he understood this wasn't going away. She didn't smile, didn't feel satisfaction. She just felt done. By the end of the week, the entire operation had collapsed. The development deals were dissolved. The properties that had been seized were returned to their rightful owners. The lawsuits began piling up, and the city officials who had turned a blind eye were suddenly forced to explain why. Eleanor Hayes kept her home, and Emma finally stood on her land again, not on a vacant lot, not on a pile of dirt where her house had once stood, but on her land restored to her name, untouchable. Dan stood beside her, hands in his pockets, watching as she took it all in. "So," he said finally, "was it worth it?" Emma inhaled, the air sharp and cool against her lungs, the weight of everything finally settling, the battle finally over. "It wasn't about being worth it," she said quietly. "It was about making sure they never do it again." Dan nodded once, a quiet understanding passing between them. There was nothing left to say. The fight was over, and she had won.